I wanted to just say that this is our last session, but it has been exceedingly meaningful and worthy, and I am so grateful to Ori for this. I should tell you all that that the response to this 8 session series has been really very heartening. And whether you know it or not, Ori has he's got a grin on his face with your response. And the reason why is because, so Ori and I were involved in a debate this summer when he said this would really be, a really worthy experience. And I said, yeah, I know, but I don't think that people in our community are going to do 8 sessions. It's a big commitment. And I just know the people, and I don't think it's going to work. I think we should just do a couple of maybe 1 session classes and just do it like that. And Ori, basically he argued and said, no, I really believe in this as the way to do this. And I really believe in, at my core, he said that for me to do something which is just a very brief survey and not go into detail and not give people true kind of, not just material, but just real fertile material, that we would be missing an opportunity. And I said, you know what, Ori, I trust, you've been an educator for a long time. I trust your instincts. I disagree with you, but we're gonna do it anyway. And he was right and I was wrong. That I thought that it was going to be too much. And this is showing not just that it's not just that this is just such an important subject for us, but also, and most importantly, that that people do thirst for more than just a superficial understanding of something, but truly thirst for a very deep and thorough understanding. And so Ori, mea culpa for arguing with you, and and thank you, of course. Though perhaps partly why it's been so successful is because of your skill as a teacher and as an educator, and we are just so deeply grateful for that. This is our last session. It's kind of more of like a processing. Where do we go from here? How do we make sense of this? What does this mean? And last week's session was a very heavy one. There's no question. And since last week, we know that there has been great heaviness in our hearts too. And so I think we've all kind of looked forward to having the opportunity to process it and hear Ori's reflections on it too. So Ori, you, not me.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. I appreciate it always, and clearly, I think you overemphasize any kind of real argument, but I do think that this would not have happened without you, and of course, without the congregation. And it goes without saying that it's very appreciated that you are all here. Not that you need me to tell you that I'm appreciating you, other than it's nice to be around like-minded folks. That's what I'm saying. Also, as you may remember, we stopped in the middle last session in that we only got through part of it, and the idea was that we're going to use this session today to continue in our storyline, because really we only dealt with really what focused around Gaza, and today we're shifting up north, even though we're not leaving Gaza behind by any stretch of the imagination. And also, I will say that I'm guessing, as you may imagine, as things continuously happening in between sessions, and I add things to our presentation, we may go a little bit over our time-wise, if that's okay. And I'm happy, even if I utilize all of our time in presenting, I'm more than happy to stay longer. At this point, I'm up, so it doesn't matter. and I'm happy to stay longer if people would like to process beyond the presentation. All right, I'm going to jump right in so we can maximize our time. I will share my screen. And we will pick up right where we left off. If just to remind you, last time we ended with a little bit of an overview of Hamas without getting into too much detail because really there's enough information out there. And I essentially said that all really we need to know about Hamas and any of our enemies for that matter is that if we've learned anything, and this is not a left-wing statement or a right-wing statement or any kind other than a practical realpolitik, as it were, that if someone tells us they're going to destroy us, we need to believe them. And all we have to do is read what Hamas says it plans to do again and again. And this is true also of Hezbollah, and this is true also of Iran. Okay. I've mentioned Alma before, and again, I think you would do yourself well if you were to find their website. Sarit Zahavi, who is a colonel in the reserves in Israel's military intelligence, really has broken many ceilings on her path and has created this organization, which is it's civilian. She's not doing this through the military, but on her own, with her own experience, and really, as she says, uses open source intelligence by essentially listening to what Iranians are saying, to what Lebanese are saying, what's happening in Syria, and through that and her own assessment and her teams, which includes Jews and Druze, and really a more complete overview of the region, you would do well to find her and her website. Either way, she was able to stitch together early on, even before the war begins, a meeting of these individuals that you see in front of you, all coordinated meeting within within the space of Hassan Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah. But what this shows us is that there was in fact coordination on October 7th, and the response Iran gave, or that Hezbollah gave, we had no idea that this was happening, clearly is not accurate information, as there was a coordination of sorts before all of this happens. Some of the members, by the way, some of the people on this screen are no longer alive since the beginning of the war. Now, if we're looking at the north, looking at some of the information that was very nicely packaged for us for the INSS, these are the latest numbers, although the one difference is if we look at missiles fired from Syria or Lebanon, about 7,560, you need to add about 100 because that's what happened today. 100 projectiles were fired from Lebanon into the Galilee. And this is an early image that was taken just to show you a little bit. We're going to look at various angles and perspectives of our border with Lebanon and with Syria, just as we did way back when we looked at the Gaza Strip and, of course, the Western Galilee from multiple angles, zooming in, zooming out, so that we really solidify what does this area look like. So as we move forward, and we will be moving forward, not in this in this presentation, but in general, the real war hasn't even yet begun. And that's going to be with Lebanon, Syria, and Iran directly. Not that it hasn't already started, but we should be very aware of what things look like on the ground so that we're best prepared as things unfold down the road. But you can just see as an example, Metula, which is our most northern community here in Israel, in what's called the tip of the finger of the Galilee, right there on the border, has, in addition to being evacuated, and we will talk about evacuation in just a few moments, has seen much of its residential area, and it's a small, sleepy hollow, destroyed. The homes there have been destroyed, many of them because of the ongoing rocket fire. And this is from early back in October of 2023, but you can see the numbers on the north. Okay, now we're zooming out a bit and we're looking at the larger scale of the region. You can see where the Golan Heights are, which is, of course, part of the state of Israel. You can see the Galilee and the Upper Galilee in particular, along with Syria over here in the pink and Lebanon up in yellow. Now you can see the dotted lines that are here in blue. This is all in Israel. And yet, if you go back in your minds to maybe 3 sessions ago, 4 sessions ago, when we discussed the southern Lebanese security zone that Israel created in the after the first few years of our war in Lebanon, the first Lebanon war, Israel pulls back to a security zone that we can deploy in order to stop our enemies in Lebanese territory without having to do a firefight within the children's homes of the kibbutzim of the north. Once again, we see a security zone, and that is this time, however, located within the 1 to 6 kilometer range within Israel proper. A little bit broad, and yet zooming into what's going on in Lebanon, where in fact is their arsenal. You can see that this particular slide goes back a few years. And this is just a reminder. I could have taken a more recent slide, and yet I want to remind ourselves that our war with Hezbollah did not begin on October 8th when they fired the first shots within this particular war. In fact, even the language, our war with Hezbollah, is one that we should check at the door if we want to have a geopolitical a realistic view of our war in the region. Why would we absolve the sovereign country of Lebanon of any wrongdoings if in fact they are sovereign in their own land, and in fact that Hezbollah is an integral part of the government, the leadership of the country of Lebanon, and de facto have taken over Lebanon, and this has been done at the release of the state. And therefore, language is important. Interesting enough, we haven't heard that public presentation of Israel at war with Lebanon, and rather only Israel at war with Hezbollah. Maybe it should be that way. Either way, I think it is interesting the lack of response in the world, considering the fact, as you can once again see the numbers on the screen, that a sovereign country has fired into Israel, killed 50 Israelis, and caused almost 70,000 Israelis in that security zone, now in Israel proper, to be evacuated from their homes for 11 months. What we're looking at once again is, on the one hand, we have these Hezbollah flags all over southern Lebanon. This blue line you can see my cursor on is the Litani River. That's the 40-kilometer mark that Hezbollah and the state of Lebanon has ignored as part of our disengagement from Lebanon in the aftermath of the Second Lebanon War. That was part of the agreement imposed by the United Nations. And the image on the left, you can see this crisscrossed area is in Israel proper and is that security zone that Israelis have been evacuated from. There are still Israelis living there, meaning those Israelis who were refused to be evacuated, and those Israelis who are part of essential industry, whether it's food-based or other industry that is up in the very north of Israel, and also those Israelis who are part of the immediate security, civil security teams that have hold on to their communities. And lastly, of course, Israeli soldiers. But otherwise, 60,000 plus have been evacuated. Now it's all in Hebrew, but it's when it wasn't necessary to translate, I didn't. These are only up until the month of May, to give us a sense of a real turning point, because really 5,210 was the amount of times the sirens sounded because of incoming projectiles in the north. And that was more than the south had seen. And 1,000 are the amount of rockets that were fired over and projectiles in the month of May, and it's only gotten much, much worse. This is in January, February, March, April, and then you see the jump in May, and it's only gotten worse since. Okay, now we're going to see just different examples of imagery dealing with where have there been projectiles fired on. And you can see the red dots are 50 to 100 attacks in that same spot. You can see where there's been only one singular attack. Now, again, this is only as of July of 2024, but it gives us a sense, a breakdown. You can also see the distance of where Haifa is in relation to the Lebanese border. Haifa, which is Israel's main city, the largest city in the north, which will be a primary target because of its industry, because of the hospital, and of course the civilian population when the war enhances from the north. Just a slight visual of what does it mean when projectiles are fired. Now, this is back in April of 2024, and this is just a little bit of a window into what does projectiles, rockets fired at Israel look like when there is the Iron Dome response. The announcement is saying for all of the civil security teams, please enter into safe spaces. This is the time to enter into safe spaces. It's talking about Metula and the neighboring villages. This is what's happening when incoming rockets fall. When I say houses are destroyed, that's what it looks like. And if we continue from that point in April, again, a few snapshots. That's all we're looking at. This is the city of Kiryat Shmone, and you can see the aftermath of incoming projectiles. You can see over here, not too far from the border with Lebanon, a little bit further down, the ongoing fires that are happening within the vicinity of that finger of the Galilee. And again, looking at just some facts and figures, we're talking about 146 square kilometers of burnt forestry in the north, or vegetation in general. 8 square kilometers down south, by the way. It's a much smaller area, of course. Both of these, and you can see, just reading what's on the screen, how much more forest fires there are. We often do not have at random forest fires. We don't really have lightning strikes. There are forest fires. It often happens because of human negligence. That's generally the reason we have forest fires. But you can see how much more intense it's been when we talk about more than 20,000 projectiles fired at Israel since October 7th. Now, focusing in on a particular area, you remember back at the end of July, the horrific attack in the Golan Heights by Hezbollah, of rocket fire that landed in the Druze village of Majd el-Shams. The Druze, I believe we mentioned them at a certain point as we made our way through our sessions when we spoke specifically about the protests in the streets back about 5 or 6 years, when we talked about, even though Druze are an integral part of Israeli society, are Israelis for the most part. There are Druze in the Golan Heights who chose permanent residency instead of citizenship in the aftermath of the 6-Day War because of fear of the Syrian government vis-a-vis the Druze who are their family members in Syria. While that's a different conversation, the Druze in Israel have taken on mandatory conscription since the early 1950s. This fact, however, that these are not Jewish Israelis, didn't change the fact for Hezbollah as they went ahead and they slaughtered 10 of these Druze children in the village of Majd el-Shams in Israel's Golan Heights. This was obviously horrific. Much outcry, maybe briefly in the world, but really the rockets were landed here in the soccer field that there was a local competition that was taking place. There was safe space. There was a migunit that was there. And yet the rocket fell immediately with very little time between the siren and the actual impact. Now, as far as the estimated amount of Hezbollah arsenal, we're looking at about 200,000 or so, even more projectiles, 250,000 projectiles that Hezbollah has. You can see a very large, significant number of mortar shells. We have rockets up to 80 kilometers, rockets with more than 200 kilometers, not to mention drones, thousands and thousands also of precision missiles. This is what we're up against. And if we want to look at an image that gives us a sense, from October 8th, meaning the first projectiles fired at this particular war, all the way up until October 8th, this is just the latest that INS has produced. Like I said, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of more rockets have been fired and projectiles have been fired at Israel since October 8th. And yet this gives us a sense. The blue markings are where there were single projectiles that landed. And you can see the other ones, such as in Metula with 135 over here. Sorry, Kiryat Shmona, 135, or 89 in Metula, which have fallen. This is what we're up against. Now, when we talk about evacuees, this is just one small slice, one image, one family. But when we talk about front lines, I on the one hand, I want to say, think of what it might be to raise your family in a hotel room for 11 months, but we can't possibly even imagine. There's definitely no empathy because we have no way to compare to anything we've been through. I suppose we can imagine how challenging it would be, and still we would be off, because in most cases, while both men and women have been called up to the reserves, in most cases, it is women who have been left on the front line of holding their family together. And this is no less heroic than those who are on the other front line, facing down the barrels of Hamas or Hezbollah. I took some screenshots of the news just in the past couple of months to give us a sense of how many have been evacuated, how many have returned home, how many have looked at alternate housing, and also how has that changed? We're speaking, of course, of those in the north. These are those in the north. And then kind of, it's a little maybe clustered on the screen. You have the Hebrew in the center, and then I went ahead and translated on the side so you can just focus on that. We're looking at numbers in the south to give us a little bit of a comparison. Who has returned? Who hasn't? Who has stayed in hotels? Who has tried to figure it out on their own because they just can't possibly stay in the hotels anymore? There was real fear earlier in August, up until the middle of August, that hotels were going to come to an end. And the government was going to say, okay, everybody come back, except for those that were not allowing to because of security reasons. And yet hotel rooms as an option have continued till the end of the year now.
Just as a quick note, Uri, on the previous slide, I think it may be confusing to people because they may have had a typo there. That on the bottom right-hand corner where it says 52,000 were evacuated to hotels. I think that's 5,200. And so that, and just in case you were reading the translation on the bottom right corner, where it talks
Oh,
about the
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
75,000.
sorry. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. I got to
No
fix
problem.
that. Very good. Yeah. Okay. Now back to our actual war with Hezbollah that has been ongoing since October 8th, meaning not anybody in a conversation who says, and you engage with and says something along the lines of, oh, when the war with Lebanon starts, no, just slow the conversation down. People are entitled to think what they want, but just because our focus has been in the South, or seemingly in the South, because of the ground incursion there since October 27th, not to mention the beginning of the response to the onslaught of October 7th, that war has begun already in October 8th with Israel responding to the beginning of the attacks within the framework of this particular war. And specifically, in response to those children who were murdered in Majd al-Shams, in the Druze village, it was not clear what Israel's response would be. Now, the fact that Israel seems to have found an equation of a tit for tat, of a response to attack, is also very disconcerting to many Israelis, especially those within the 60 plus thousand who have been evacuated. Why isn't Israel moving completely forward and doing everything it needs to do, either to annihilate Hezbollah completely, or at least push them north of the Litani River, as per the United Nations 1701 decision resolution back in 2006? For the moment, Israel has said, we will strike when and how we decide. At the moment, we're focusing on the South. However, a major response was the targeted killing of Fuad Shukr, who is, for all intents and purposes, the chief of staff, the head of the Hezbollah military. Now, what is so profound is how Israel did this. It took out one building, one window on one floor, and you can see how clustered everything is. The Dahia neighborhood of Beirut, which is a stronghold of Hezbollah, they've embedded themselves within a civilian population, while Israel could have easily carpet bombed the entire neighborhood, took out one window in one apartment building within this neighborhood, I think is quite profound. Now, in addition, according to foreign sources, this has not been acknowledged by the state of Israel yet, and that is Ismail Haniyeh, who was the political leader of Hamas. And you can see him here on July 30th in a meeting with the Ayatollah. This was all around the inauguration of the new president. You can also see the head of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the same meeting. But just after that meeting took place, someone, according to foreign sources, Israel, there just hasn't been an official acknowledgement yet, went ahead, found the building in the neighborhood of Tehran, and this is a very elite area where foreign dignitaries are kept. One window, one floor, one building that was specifically taken out. Now, there's some question. Was this, according to Iran, this was a projectile of some kind, a missile, a rocket? And in fact, it seems as if, based on intelligence, that there was some kind of explosive that was placed specifically in a particular room under a particular bed or chair that was waiting for this particular individual. Now, just to, for a moment, step back to Gaza, in addition to those who were eliminated by Israel and targeted as a strategic step that is not just one tactical, oh, that person murdered someone, so we're going to kill them, but a much broader view. This isn't just punishment, but Muhammad Dif, who had been a target of Israel back since the days of the Second Intifada and even before that, was taken out in July of 2024. Now, while this was true, meaning the assassination took place, it wasn't confirmed yet until August 1st. Israel wanted to make sure that it was very clear that there was no, because it wouldn't be the first time that Israel thought it had assassinated Muhammad Dif, going back to 2014 and even earlier than that, and they had not. But this too was a very strategic hit. Now back to Lebanon. You may remember not too long ago, just a couple of weeks, even less than a couple of weeks, there was a moment very early in the morning in Israel, and you, before you went to sleep, probably saw it even before we woke up, that Israel preemptively struck with over 100 jets, 100 warplanes into Lebanon. This was the very first preemptive en masse strike that Israel took. And while it was very successful, because the preemptiveness of it was to eliminate thousands and thousands and thousands of rockets that were lined up and ready to go to be fired at Israel throughout Israel, because actually Hezbollah has projectiles that can reach all the way to the very tip of Eilat, Israel was able to preempt that and take them out while they were still on the ground. There was real anxiety that this would be that moment of full-blown war with Hezbollah, taking the fight to Hezbollah. But the anxiety came with almost relief that, as painful as this is, this needs to happen, or we will never see a return of Israelis to the Galilee again. It seems as if this was a one-time shot, at least for that moment in time, as successful as it was. Speaking of a one-time shot, back in April, between April 13th and 14th, we saw a direct attack by Iran against Israel. I highlight this, even though we're taking a half a step back, because we know that Iran has been directly behind the arming and support of Hezbollah, of Hamas, of Islamic Jihad, of the Houthis, and yet this was the first time that projectiles would be fired from Iran directly towards Israel, and en masse. You can see the numbers that are on the screen right now. And yes, there was a Bedouin girl who was badly injured, although she's doing better. But other than that, there were no casualties. And therefore, this was so significant. Now, two things I want to point out. One, it just happens to be that my middle daughter, Shira, who just got out of Iron Dome, was the woman in the room where it happened, as she may very well be the very first in the world to intercept incoming projectiles from Iran directly fired on Israel. There, I said it, it's out there. What are you going to do? And the second thing I want to point out is I didn't put this particular clip together, and it's somewhat frivolous, maybe almost tongue-in-cheek, and yet worthwhile, because I think you'll see the music very much fits the setting, which is all the intercepts of the incoming projectiles from Iran on this early morning of October 14th. We have a Houthi front since the beginning of the war. This is unbelievable. We have no border with the Houthis. We have no beef with the Houthis. We've taken no land or given no land, or there's been no conquest. And yet you can see that within Yemen, these Houthis, and you may know that Yemen is divided into two, one part that's Sunni and one part that's been taken over by force in a civil war by Shiite Muslims who are supported directly by Iran. They have created a town over here, the town of Dimona, where they are planning and practicing to physically overtake, even though their border is thousands of kilometers away from Israel. This has not stopped them from firing projectiles, not just at us, but if you go all the way down here at the bottom of the Red Sea, and you see where Yemen is from the very beginning of the war, and we'll come back to American involvement for sure, but any ship within this area either deemed to be making their way to the port of Eilat or any military in support of the state of Israel has been fired on by the Houthis. Now, of the hundreds of attacks that the Houthis have fired on Israel, and I will just add that my oldest daughter, Meitav, for the most a big chunk of her reserve duty, which was 150 days, was stationed down south, either in the Negev or on the very tip of Eilat, and in fact was involved with the intercept of those incoming projectiles. But there was one that got through with tragic outcome, and you may remember back in the middle of July, a drone that came through and by chance and made its way all the way up towards Tel Aviv. This is what it looked like. This by chance happened to be caught as the drone came over shoreline from the Mediterranean into Tel Aviv. And that was the moment of impact and also the cause of the death of a 50-year-old Israeli, Yevgeny Fedor. Interesting enough, Israel responded very harshly then, that it hadn't done up until then, which is interesting because projectiles are fired, Israel's intercepting, by the way, utilizing also one of our three-tiered defense line that we have. The Iron Dome is the short to mid-range projectiles, again, invented by Israel. We know that story. There's something called David Sling, which is utilized for mid-range projectiles, and the Arrow 1, 2, and 3, which was created by Israel in order to intercept long-range projectiles, including ballistic ones, meaning the Arrow 3 can intercept in space thousands of kilometers from Israel's shores. So we've used that for the first time in a warlike moment, but Israel took out a very significant strategic location and real estate of the Houthis. Another front line that we have that, as you may have been following, has gotten even more significant. But the West Bank, again, reminding ourselves that that is perhaps the more generic of the terms that we can use to describe the occupied territories on the one hand, or Judea and Samaria. Those who know will choose the language that they believe in ideologically. However, the West Bank has become a hotbed within this war. It was already a hotbed, and yet within this war, and you can see these are some of the latest numbers and some terrible outcomes as well. You can see Hamas firing within Israel proper, from within the West Bank, on the western edges of the West Bank, towards Israeli communities just within Israel proper, just beyond the Green Line, or within the Green Line, let's say, and ongoing terrorist attacks, which include, in the last 2 weeks, 4 attempts of suicide bombings. One within Israel proper, Hamas that set out from Jenin into Israel, into Tel Aviv, South Tel Aviv, and by miracle of miracles, just a couple of weeks ago, the explosive device on the backpack of the Hamas terrorists blew up just maybe 100 meters or so from a synagogue that was full flow Saturday night, and from other commercial areas. Nobody was killed, and one Israeli was injured, but other than that, nothing else happened. There have been 3 attempts of explosive vehicles within the West Bank, 2 of which detonated early, and 1 that was waiting, had a actually camera waiting for a school bus to go by, which was discovered by civilians and was able to be dismantled by the bomb squad. In one of those terrorist attacks, however, not far from Hebron, this officer, the 61-year-old First Sergeant Roni Shakuri, was killed, and painfully, he is the father of a young police officer who was killed in the battle for the Sderot police station in Sderot. Those of us who were together this past summer were right there across from now what is an empty lot where the police station once stood. We are currently within a very focused operation called Machanot Kait in Hebrew. The translation is summer camps, that is geared towards focusing specifically on the terrorist cells that have been building up in the area of the West Bank. It has not been lost to Israelis' eyes the ongoing violence of Israeli settlers against those who are not Jewish in the West Bank. That is not to say that all of the 500,000 or so Israelis who are living beyond the green line are violent. There's been absolutely an uptick in the violence, which includes what seemed to be a lynch, in fact, terrorism against an Israeli family. This was a Bedouin Israeli family that had gone to go shopping in Nablus, Shechem. They took a wrong turn at the entrance to a settlement, one of these illegal outpost settlements, and they were lynched almost to save themselves. By the way, the 2 that were taken earlier, I haven't yet updated this slide, have been charged with terrorism. Not something which is common that we hear that language used against Israelis. And there have been other incidents as well. And there's an awareness that the groups that are within Israeli populations that have been emboldened by certain politicians, that is those on the far right, to become even more violent than they were. That is not a political statement. That is a factual statement. And it's not lost on the Israeli military, who have said as such, as well as our secret, not the Secret Service, but our version of your FBI, Shabak. Now, speaking of different units that we have, I brought you this screen, which was actually taken, these images from earlier in the war in the vicinity of the Gaza Strip, that is in the area of the Western Galilee. And while you have soldiers on the one hand, you also have representatives of a unit called Zaka. Zaka is a civilian volunteer organization, while not only, yes, primarily Haredi Jews who have taken upon themselves to collect any remnant of human body possible to bring that to burial. Now, in a moment, you're going to see a screen of Zaka, but they're not handling bodies, but rather artifacts connected to those bodies to see if, through closer analysis, is there in fact any blood on these clothing and artifacts, because often they will then go ahead and bury those artifacts, as they did, by the way, with some of the vehicles. And you remember some of the slides that we saw from earlier in the war in the vicinity of Nova, etc. Some of those vehicles were actually buried as is because you couldn't separate the human remains from the vehicle. Now, if we're already speaking about Israeli civilian society, I think we do need to take a step back to look at that response. And I think I've said this before, but it's worth saying again. Of all of those moments that we didn't recognize, all of those moments that added to the collapse of the fence, that same fence we saw, the first screen that we saw. So many other parts of our world collapsed. Our sense of self, our sense of strength, the inability, what we thought of our enemies, all of that turned on its head. The one thing we recognized rather, was that resilience and that response of Israelis. And if you weren't charging down, banging on your base's door, that if you weren't called, remember we said 100% call up, 120% show up to reserves, you were doing something within civilian society, either utilizing your skills, creating databases, or collecting, distributing anything and everything civil society needed. And I believe, Ari, Hannah, when you were here in December, you worked in one of these spaces, specifically with Brothers and Sisters in Arms, which was a movement created during the civil protests that started in January of 2023. A group of like-minded special forces operators, pilots, officers who said, we have given and we have given and we have given and will continue to give, but we will not go beyond what's demanded of us legally and will no longer volunteer the extra time demanded of us in our military service if a government like this is going to change what Israel needs. And yet, when the call came, they were the ones, as a movement, as an organization that is, that saved Israel. And many of us did what we could, whether it was our own private families or even our family's relatives, such as my wife's sister, one of her sisters that came from New York earlier in the war to do whatever she could. School kids. You can see my youngest daughter over here with her friends, also in the field. Jews and Arabs coming together, doing whatever was needed. That were created and distributed, these smiling soldiers, don't tell them. They thought the boxes were for them. No, no, no. These boxes were for us who deliver them, because it was something to do. It allowed us to give a real embrace to those on our front lines. And even while those were on our front lines, very quickly in the war, a war cabinet was created. And you can see the body language of our leaders. At the time, we have Bibi Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, and Benny Gantz, who is the head of a leading opposition, not the largest party, because Yair Lapid was the head of the opposition, is the head of the opposition. But Benny Gantz came in as a former chief of staff, along with his number two, a also former head of staff, a chief of staff of the IDF, Gadi Eisenkot over here, and along with Yoav Gallant, who is a Likud member through and through, Minister of Defense, served as the core group of those deciding on the war, what we called the war cabinet. That was the case earlier on in the war. And just to give us a sense of the relationship, it wasn't just that body language between Gantz and Bibi, but there's no love lost between one of Likud's favorite sons, Yoav Gallant. This image was an image taken back from March of 2023, when all of those who had been protesting government and protesting the judicial reform took to the streets when Benjamin Netanyahu fired Yoav Gallant, came to him, and actually not to him because Bibi wouldn't take a meeting, and then went public and said, our enemies are watching our weaknesses because they're watching our protests, and something has to be done to eliminate this particular threat. And all of those who've been protesting the government then took to the streets, hundreds of thousands, in just a matter of hours, to demand that Gantz be reinstated, which he was. Gallant. Now, this kind of resilience, again and again, within Israeli society, in the most painful moments, one of which I want to share with you now. The three young men that you see on the screen were the three hostages that were killed accidentally by Israeli troops back in the middle of December when they managed to escape their captors. I can't remember a more painful moment, and we've had many painful moments. And then Yotam Chaim's mother sends out this message, and you can read the English on the screen, as she speaks to the soldiers on the ground and in fact responsible for the death, the immediate responsibility, meaning those who killed her son. Now, looking at various front lines that we have, one of those is in the media. And these are just a few examples that Israel's dealing with internationally. This was early on. Eylon Levy, who used to be this upcoming star of Israeli advocacy for the state of Israel, was later fired because Sarah Netanyahu, according to reports, didn't like the fact that Eylon Levy, during those protests against the judicial reform, was caught on camera as part of the protesters, and yet was the best voice for Israel. By the way, he's later found his footing, has his own advocacy podcast. Anyway, this was really what caused him to come to fame. His response to a British newscaster from the BBC or Sky News who was sharing a certain question.
Ori can't hear, man.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to stop the share for a moment, and I'm going to go back and do this and this, and this and this, and we're back in business.
Promised to release, as opposed to the 150 prisoners that are Palestinians that Israel has said that it will release. And he made the comparison between the numbers and the fact that, does Israel not think that Palestinian lives are valued as highly as Israeli lives?
That is an astonishing accusation. If we could release one prisoner for every one hostage, we would obviously do that. We're operating in horrific circumstances. We're not choosing to release these prisoners who have...
So you could see the eyebrows that went up. By the way, I think somebody might be unmuted because I hear there was an echo. I don't know if anybody else heard it. But the accusation was back in November that because Israel was releasing three Palestinian terrorists in our jails for one hostage, the newscaster was referring to somebody else's response that Israel thinks that Palestinians are less than a human. Also, listen to this particular newscaster who is describing evidently what Israel is doing in Gaza, and that is targeting Arabic speakers and medical personnel.
They are targeting people, including medical teams as well as Arab speakers. Once again, we are hearing from Reuters that Israel says that its forces are carrying out an operation against Hamas in that hospital that we had just heard of.
She said, targeting Arabic speakers and medical personnel. And here is the BBC giving an apology of sorts.
And now an apology from the BBC. BBC News, as it covered initial reports that Israeli forces has entered Gaza's main hospital. We said that medical teams and Arab speakers were being targeted. This was incorrect and misquoted a Reuters report. We should have said IDF forces included medical teams and Arabic speakers for this operation. So we apologize for this error.
Okay, thank you for the apology. Evidently, you're sending in medical teams to take care of Palestinians. Well, we missed that. And in response, Israeli satire hasn't held any punches. I am showing you the most tame of our responses to some of those BBC announcers. Hold on.
Are you telling me that there is an Israeli baby that's torturing you by sleep deprivation?
What? Yes!
Occupying your house?
Yes!
So unfair, so unfair. And the world does absolutely nothing about it.
They are
Talking to a hospital.
Now, in order to place you in a particular physical place that has been central during this war, that is Hostage Square, I want you to look just for a moment at its origin. Its origin started just days after October 7th, when Avichai Brodich stood in front of our Ministry of Defense, also known as the Kiryah in Tel Aviv. And he had a sign that says, "My family is in Gaza," because his wife and his 3 children were kidnapped. Fortunately for him, his family returned to him at the end of November. But from that single person standing there with a sign in front of the Kiryah turned into this. This has become known as Hostage Square, which is across the street from the Kiryah and in front of the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. We won't do an entire tour, but just to give us a visual of what we're talking about. This was back when 107 days had passed that I took this film originally. So quite a while ago. To remind us, we're at day 334. You can see that in front of the Tel Aviv Museum of Art are grassroots installations, each one coming to describe, to represent something, whether it's this ongoing tunnel that you can see here that by no means is meant to, let me just move along here. Hold on. It's not to show us what a tunnel is like, because you can't possibly do that, but in fact to give us a sense of what hopelessness might look like. We're going to come back to the square soon enough. Every Saturday evening has been a focal point of where society has come through. Not everybody. We'll talk about divisions within Israel, but this is back on day 77, and this was thousands and thousands who had come together to be together in support of the families, and you can see it's pouring rain. They're saying everybody now.
תודה שבאתם להיות איתנו ועם האהובים שלנו בגשם, ברוח, אנחנו אוהבים אתכם, אנחנו
This was on day 100. Agam Goldstein, Almog, was an 18-year-old girl who had been in captivity, who had been kidnapped, released in November. What she has to say on day 100 in January.
שוב פעם נכנס לך למקלחת, הפשיט אותך מהפיג'מה שנתן לך, תוך כדי גם נגע בפציעת הכדור שירה בך. זה כאב לך ממש, אבל השליטה שלו בך כאבה יותר. הגוף שלך כשלו, ככה הוא התייחס אלייך. נכון חברה שלי? ואת שם, אתן שם, לבד, כל כך לבד, וכבר עבר כל כך הרבה זמן.
If we're looking for strength, yes, those soldiers who are giving their lives, absolutely. This young girl, this young woman is no less a hero of standing up and sharing her experience and speaking to her friends who are still in hostages.
שלום, קוראים לי יובל שרבי ואני מבארי. באותה השבת ראיתי במו עיניי את אבא שלי, יוסי שרבי זיכרונו לברכה, ואת החבר שלי אופיר אנגל, נלקחים על ידי מחבלים לתוך רכב שנוסע מאיתנו. בהמשך גילינו שאלי שרבי, דוד שלי, נחטף גם הוא. אשתו ליאן ושתי בנותיו, נויה ויעל, נרצחו בביתן. ובנוסף, בן הדוד שלי עידן הרמן וחברתו עדן, זיכרונם לברכה, נרצחו בנובה. 101 מקהילת בארי נרצחו, 30 נחטפו. כעת 11 מאהובינו עדיין שם. אבא שלי, יוסי שרבי, זיכרונו לברכה, אלי שרבי, אוהד בן עמי, שר ברוך, זיכרונו לברכה, מני גודארד, זיכרונו לברכה, טל שוהם, כרמל גת, איתי סבירסקי, זיכרונו לברכה.
As you may know, Carmel Gatz is one of the 6 who was just executed by Hamas just a few days ago. But every Saturday night, this is what we're experiencing when between 40,000 and 80,000, it fluctuates, gather in front of Hostage Square. Now, a few months ago, Hostage Square also hosted a format known as Slicha al Hashe'ela. Excuse me for the question. It's a TV show here, and different communities within Israel, sometimes on the periphery, are given a series of questions and offered an opportunity to share with the public. Maybe they're LGBTQ, maybe they're from the Druze community, maybe they're specially or differently abled, whatever it may be. In this particular case, the format was called "Excuse Me for My Answer," because it's straight talk with the family of the parents of a fallen soldier, with the relatives of hostages, with evacuees, so that we hear with our own ears.
עמית אשכנזי, אני גם אחות של דורון שטיינברכר שחטופה כבר 200 ימים בשבי חמאס, אבל אני גם ניצולת הטבח מכפר עזה, ואני רוצה דווקא, לפני שאני אומרת איפה הייתי ב7 באוקטובר, אז ב5 באוקטובר הייתי בפסטיבל התמר עם בעלי, וזה בערך הדבר האחרון שעשינו שקשור ליקום המקביל שלפני 7 באוקטובר. ב6 באוקטובר עשינו ארוחת חג אצלי במרפסת, בעצם פעם אחרונה שהמשפחה הייתה ביחד, וב7 באוקטובר קמנו לקולות של פיצוצים, הודעות שיש מחבלים בכפר עזה. אז ממש לא היינו מודעים לגודל האירוע, חשבנו שזה 5 מחבלים, הכיתת כוננות הגיבורה שלנו שנפלו כמעט כולם באותו אירוע. חשבנו שהכיתת כוננות תטפל בזה, שהצבא מיד יגיע. לא חשבתי שאני אהיה 21 שעות בממ"ד עם 2 ילדים קטנים, שאנחנו נהיה לבד במשך 21 שעות. ואנחנו, השאלה היא איפה הייתם ב7 באוקטובר, אבל אני עדיין ב7 באוקטובר, כל עוד אחותי ושאר החטופים עדיין בעזה. עמית אשכנזי, אני...
I'm moving through a little bit. I just want to share the family of the soldier that we just saw was killed in the rescue, the successful rescue of 2 of the hostages. However, there have been cases also where the bodies of hostages were retrieved in special operations. We spoke a little bit about that. In a moment, I'll share who this young man over here was involved in retrieving. This is Gadi Eisenkot from his days as the chief of staff, and this is his son Gal. His son Gal was painfully killed in the operation to retrieve the bodies of Eden Zacharia, who had been at the Nova Party, and Ziv Dado, who was a warrant officer who was killed on October 7th. We talk about our leadership, or at least the leadership we look to, who clearly has deep roots and responsibility. And at the time that he was part of the war cabinet, he and Gantz were those responsible adults that whether you voted for them or you didn't, you wanted them in the room. And he too paid that ultimate price. There's more of those moments in Hostage Square that are very profound that we can always share. And like I said, I know I'm going to be going over my time, but I want to be able to share a few other things. And this is just how the evenings in the Hostage Square begin and close when each of the names and the faces are shared with all of us. Now, in addition to Hostage Square, which if you look at my cursor for a moment, down this way and to the left is where Hostage Square is on the other side of the Ministry of Defense, the Kiryat. This is called Begin Street. This is called Kaplan Street. Why do I mention those streets? Because each one has its own community almost. There are those at Hostage Square that are trying to be as apolitical as possible and yet give all of their support to the hostages, who are trying to generate enough grassroots pressure on the government so that everything is done to retrieve by deal or otherwise, and if not otherwise, then by a deal. There are those here on Begin Street who are also families of hostages, albeit a smaller group, much more vocal against this particular government. There are those on Kaplan Street who are those who are saying the only thing we should be focused on is changing this government now. Now, ideologically, all three groups want the same, and yet getting there has different paths. This is perhaps the beginning to talk about that internal division we are feeling amongst ourselves. And within Israel, that unity that we had that was ironclad in the beginning is fraying at the corners. And perhaps it's a miracle it's lasted this long, this unity. And yet within Israeli society, we're feeling a real rupture, a real dissonance with our government. Many of us, even those who vote on the right. In our current government, there are those who are willing to disrupt what has been sacred ground, even penetrating into bases to try and demand that Israel not hold on to full of Israeli soldiers accused of abusing Nukba prisoners who were captured on October 7th. The majority of Israelis were not behind breaking into Israeli bases. In the same way that the majority of Israelis support Ben-Gvir, our Minister of Internal Security, in fact, changing the status quo by openly allowing public Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. Now, one could argue, well, if Muslims can stand in front of the Western Wall, why can't Jews pray in the Temple Mount? It's a whole other conversation. And yet he seems to single-handedly be changing that status quo. Sorry, let me go back for a second. I just point out here, sorry, the prime minister's response is that Ben Gvir doesn't dictate what is policy of the government and what isn't, and nothing has changed, and yet nothing has been said publicly by the prime minister to chastise Ben Gvir, or to fire him for that matter, for openly standing against the policies of this current government. That's the internal divide even within our government, and yet we seem to see a reality in which a tail is in fact wagging the dog. The Attorney General has made it very clear that she is, it's seemingly, the last stronghold or bastion to stand up against certain actions by this current government. Without getting into details, this is just an example. And other internal debates within Israeli society that have erupted, while we saw much more unity even amongst Israeli Haredi, ultra-Orthodox Jews. At the beginning of the war, this has openly been rejected, as we see no longer any law giving any kind of exemption to Haredi men to IDF conscription. And when inductions are happening of Haredi men, major protests are happening outside of bases, including ultra-Orthodox men. In the Hebrew, you can see here from the screenshot, Al titgayes, don't enlist. Small pockets of ultra-Orthodox men who choose to serve. And you can see here some very painful statements, including, myself and my children are willing to be hanged on the gallows. We enlist. Where we are. Within all of that, faced with an ongoing reality that doesn't leave us, and that is the ongoing pain and helplessness of moments like this. In the aftermath of the announcement that these 6 young people were murdered, executed, 300,000 took to the streets in Tel Aviv alone. What you see here, a meshing of the crowds of Kaplan, Begin, and the Hostage Square crowd coming together in a unified protest. And what you're seeing on the screen are images that you most likely would not see, you don't see at Hostage Square. You see Begin. Sense of the difference in the paths towards the same goal. One is return them now. We are all abducted. You can see here this young man holding a menorah. Stand up, Israel, he says. Yair would not even last a minute there, referring to Netanyahu's son, Yair Netanyahu, who's been in Miami for most of the war. Hirsch, you deserved a different end. And of course, the Israeli flag here, that no explanation needed. And speaking of the pain, this was just on Monday. We stood, my wife and I, amongst what must have been 20,000 people at the funeral of Hirsch Goldberg, Poland. And while we won't listen to everything, here's just a little bit from the eulogies of his parents.
And Hirsch was always self-assured. When we told 7-year-old Hirsch that we were moving to Israel, making Aliyah. We told him that his name Hirsch could be challenging for Israelis. Maybe you want to become Tzvi, which is the same meaning. Maybe you want to take on a nickname. We said to him, and Hirsch looked up at us and said confidently, "I'm Hirsch. Israelis will deal with that." As Hirsch got older, his curiosity, memorization, and self-assuredness evolved into deep, independent thinking. Hirsch thought about issues and developed principled conclusions. In 6th grade, at a group interview at Himmelfarb, the teacher posed a question to the visiting 6th grade boys, something about Middle East politics. And he offered 2 answers, a more liberal answer and a more conservative answer, sending the boys who answered each to different sides of the room. That night, Hirsch told us about the interview and that he went to the side of the room that he did. And we said, "How many others were on your side?" And he shrugged and said, "Just me."
John will go ahead and share, among other things, that one of the posts that he saw was most telling about who Hirsch was, when the post said, may his memory be for a revolution. Yhi zichro ma'apecha. And just a taste from his mom.
I've had a lot of time during the past 332 days to think about my sweet boy, Hirsch. And one thing I keep thinking about is how out of all of the mothers in the whole entire world, God chose to give Hirsch to me. What must I have done in a past life to deserve such a beautiful gift? It must have been glorious. Hirsch and I once watched some documentaries a couple years ago together about young people who had died. And he commented, "How come everyone who dies young is always said to be the funniest, the smartest, the greatest, the handsomest? Why doesn't anyone ever say, I liked Max, but you know what? He was pretty stupid and his sense of humor was off and he had bad breath." I am honest, and I say it's not that Hirsch was perfect, but he was the perfect son for me. And I am so grateful to God. And I want to do Hakarat Hatov and thank God right now in front of all of you for giving me this magnificent present of my Hirsch. For 23 years, I was privileged to have the most stunning honor to be Hirsch's mama. I'll take it and say thank you. Okay, sweet boy, go now on your journey. I hope it's as good as the trips you dreamed about, because finally, my sweet boy, finally, you're free. I will love you and I will miss you every single day for the rest of my life. But you're right here. I know you're right here. I just have to teach myself how to feel you in a different way. And Hirsch, there's one last thing I need you to do for us. Now I need you to help us stay strong. And I need you to help us survive.
And Hirsch.
So how does this all play out then? What do Israelis think? This is just from last week, and there have been other polls like this, but it essentially gives us a sense. If you take a look for a moment, these are the numbers. So 55% think we need an immediate election. Somehow 36% think that we need to continue. This seems to have changed slightly, as we have 63% in a later poll who think that we need not only to have a deal now, but we need immediate elections. But these are more or less the numbers. As far as how the war is going, for example, in the north, you can see 75% terrible. So that's where we are in our response to what's happening. Now, again, I took this from a screenshots from the TV, from the Channel 12 News, but from August 22nd, these were the numbers in the poll, meaning of the parties that are currently serving, if the elections were today, the Benny Gantz's party, the National Unity Party, would receive 22. Actually, I think we've seen a drop in Likud to 21 in the most recent ones. Yair Lapid with Yesh Atid 15, Yisrael Beitenu. You can see the numbers here, and then down to the very bottom, including Smotrich with his religious Zionism at 0, even though Ben Gvir over here with his party, Otzma Yehudit, has 8. But if Naftali Bennett comes into the mix, the former prime minister who unified the left and the right, we spoke about him. You can see that a party, they haven't even mentioned which party, because he hasn't joined one or invented one. He would receive 21 seats, it seems, if elections were today and he was involved. But you can see where he eats from, which parties he takes from. If there was a Lieberman, also very right-wing, and Bennett unified party, you can see that that would give them 26 seats, which means that Israelis are willing to put their weight behind a right-wing party. And yet we also see left-wing parties, such as the Labor Party, now calling themselves HaDemokratim, the Democrats, unifying the Labor Party and Meretz, a far left-wing party, and headed by Yair Golan, who is self-identified as the left-leaning political leader and yet a hero of the state of Israel, a former general who on October 7th took his gun, went down, and saved Israelis with his own hands. As far as who is best suited to be prime minister, if you pit the head of the opposition, Yair Lapid, against Netanyahu right now, you can see the numbers. If you pit Benny Gantz across from Benjamin Netanyahu, you can see the numbers. Earlier in the war, Benny Gantz got to 37% and Netanyahu 17%. But if Naftali Bennett comes into the fray, you can see the numbers there. It could be that he will be this hope, put their weight behind if he comes back into politics. Within the leadership here, we're seeing real tension. This is one snapshot of example. Still behind the scenes between the Minister of Defense making it clear to Netanyahu that if you don't go forward with a deal, the death of the hostages. And this represents the entire security apparatus. And this quote from the middle of July hasn't changed, as I'm sure you followed in the news, by the Prime Minister. It's still been very much internal within the government, and yet it has become very public. Don't put pressure on me, put pressure on Sinwar. That is the only thing that will bring to the release of the hostages. And of those hills on which Netanyahu is willing to die on, that is the factor that he isn't willing to release in exchange for a deal, that is. One is the Netzarim corridor, which essentially divides the Gaza Strip into two, that has been created by Israel in order, you can take a look here, in order to prevent armed Hamas from coming back into the northern part. Israel is not willing to give up this area. And you can see what it looked like before and what it looked like after in order to create a buffer so that Hamas isn't able to reach the northern part, which of course shortens the distance for any projectiles deeper into Israel. There's benefits to holding it, of course. Whether or not Israel can release it, that in fact hasn't been on the forefront of Bibi's demands. Most recently, it's been made very clear, and there was a very public press conference that took place last night, or 2 nights ago, that Netanyahu got up and made it very clear, we will never release the the corridor, the Philadelphia corridor. And you can see in this image here, the explanation is that it's through there that all of the weaponry utilized by Hamas came through. And the only way to funnel Israel never to give it up. Now, you have the entire security apparatus that has said, if we need to give it up for 42 days, we will do so. And we'll be able to get it back militarily. It's a much longer conversation, but we seem to see Israelis who are divided by those who agree with Netanyahu, and a majority of Israelis say no, if we don't get our hostages back now, and the only way to do that is in a deal, we will lose who we think we are, which is worse than losing the Philadelphia corridor. And all of those, though, when we talk about holding the corridor, fighting in Gaza, fighting on our northern border, are essentially our children. In this particular case, my own personal children. And some snapshots of one family, whether it's a young cousin who lives on Kibbutz Ga'aton all the way in the north and spent about 230 days in reserves as part of the security team of her kibbutz, 11 kilometers from the Lebanese border. Or here's my middle daughter, Shira, in the middle of her service. Actually, this image here is the night of April 14th, after all of those intercepts from Iran. And my oldest during her reserve duty, getting new ranks during reserve duty. Here is a young cousin, actually Maya's brother, who is a lieutenant in charge of a platoon who spent about 8 months in Gaza with his men. He's 21, 22 years old, in charge of the lives of 30 young men. Here's my nephew, Amit, on the very first night in his military service. What we say in Hebrew, Laila Rishon Bli Ima, or Abba, without the first night, without a parent, without the mother. And this is just a tailgate party that Israelis are often known to do during military service of their children when they don't come home on Shabbat. This happens to be a tailgate party during a bona fide war. And our extended Israeli family, when we don't know what to do, we come together. In this particular case, these are Israelis who didn't know what to do on Memorial Day Eve and came together in Hostage Square to stand together during the siren that starts off our Memorial Day. This is the beginning of the siren. You can see people are starting to stand. While every Memorial Day is powerful, it goes without saying how much this was as well. Now, I'm sure you've seen all of these clips. This was just an example of the power of a mother, and we saw a little bit the eulogy. But all these moments where Rachel was able to share her voice, including on the Gaza border just days before her son was murdered, maybe even Hirsch heard these words as the families of the hostages stood a kilometer from where their children may have been held.
Hirsch, it's day 328. We are all here. All the families of the remaining 107 hostages. Hirsch, we are working day and night, and we will never stop.
My name is.
Expressions of where we are clearly embodied in the voice of Rachel Goldberg and all of the hostage families who share their words every Saturday night and throughout. But we also see this outpouring of emotion on the walls of our cities, in particular in Tel Aviv, the street art. Inbar Lieberman here was a 26-year-old young woman who was the head of her civil security team on kibbutz Nir Am. And she was able to lead her team to protect her kibbutz in an incredible way in which they survived. And here she is gratefully and truly honored. We have poetry on the walls, meaning there's more than one wall in Israel that speaks volumes. In this particular case, this poet writes, Ani petza patuach, I am an open wound. I continue to bleed. I'm an open wound. Listen, my brothers, I am an open wound. My sisters are raped. I surround myself and wrap myself in sounds, and they shall be, in voices and notes, and they are my bandages. And our war isn't just on our front lines, as we know around the world. Those in support of Hamas, not Palestinians, us, over the streets, cities, as if violence is okay. And of course, we have all of those who are standing in the trenches, DC or New York or in LA. Just a few nights ago in Columbus Circle. Within all of this, those who are choosing, those on a front line, New York and other places around the world, standing with Israel. We have those who have come to literally stand in Israel. Countries that are in support of Israel, including the United States. And this particular administration, regardless of perhaps pressure here and there, is one that has been the most Zionist in the history of the state of Israel. Full stop. All these points on the map, by the way, is where America has deployed most recently all of its forces in support of the state of Israel. And without getting into the details of the proposed peace deal from a few months ago, presented by Biden as Bibi's peace deal. Clearly, there have been different clauses that have been included and not included, and yet America, even with the challenge that we face, that we don't always see eye to eye, that are happening in America, and the pressure perhaps placed on Israel, because friends don't let friends drive drunk, even when perspective from the outside is not always realistic for those of us who are on the ground here. It is clear to Israelis, more than the press would suggest, that we have a real supporter within the Biden administration, even though there are challenges. And there are those within the Democratic Party aligned with the main centerpiece of the Democratic Party, even openly anti-Israel. And yet that doesn't take away from the support Israel has felt and the friendship by the Biden administration. And the ongoing internal tensions that are building here, even when we have support from outside, internal tension within heads of the Mossad and the FBI, the Shin Bet. And we've talked about this tension between members of our cabinet. All of this go ahead when we have different figures within our government, whether in the opposition or in the coalition, and those in the coalition not standing up against Netanyahu when it seemingly has placed the return of hostages as being secondary to a broader view of securing the safety of Israel, even when there are challenges to that particular argument because, well, we didn't enter or hold on to the Philadelphia corridor until much later in the war. So where in fact is the head of Shas, Deri, and a voice of what we know is one of the greatest commandments that a Jew can do, and that is to redeem captives. But that internal debate was one that caused Benny Gantz just a few months ago to break away from that coalition cabinet, war cabinet, because he felt that there was no openness to be able to follow a direction that two chief of staff, former Eisenkot and Gantz, could influence the impact of the war and therefore pulled out. This war is felt on all levels of our society, including the Pride Parade that took place in Jerusalem just a few months ago. And within this war, the Pride Parade took place. But the reason I'm sharing with this is just as a window into Israeli society, but also, and you can see here on the banner, the image of Shai Golan. This is Shai Golan, who, when October 7th happened, was only days, weeks away from marriage to his beloved, Omer Ohana. And being an officer in one of our special forces, jumped to it. And you can see from the screenshot of an interview with Omer, after a few minutes, he already had a bag packed and was down on the front line. And ultimately, he died in the firefight in the kibbutzim down in Kibbutz Be'eri. But it was because of Omer and his voice that an incredible miracle happened. This particular coalition joined with the voices of the opposition, listened to this bereaved beloved, and as you can see on the screen, changed the law in Israel, acknowledge same-sex partners as would a widow or a widower. And if we've mentioned this before, I'll mention it again and again. I know I've gone over, but it's our last session, so we're almost there. Is that within Israeli society, everybody is a front line. This particular clip is taken from the Reform Movement's gathering, our annual meeting, as it were. And on the stage, leading the service, are rabbis who have worked with and live within the communities that were evacuated, whether in the perimeter of Gaza or in the north. Everybody is a line. And we have moments of elation, of heroism, unbelievable faith in our ability back in June when these 4 individuals were rescued. In a heroic moment that caught all of us as if someone had given us a life assuring resuscitation. As these 4 young people were literally grabbed from the bowels of hell by a team of special police force officers of the Yamam, commanded by Arnon Zamora. Later, the operation to save them was called Operation Arnon because of, well, him. This is just a clip. There's going to be some shooting, but the reason I want to share this with you is because the moment in which the soldiers find the hostages, this is what takes place.
כנס, כנס. אחד איתי.
He's saying Hebrew, where is everyone? He says, we're here to take you away, to save you. Please be relaxed. And he gives him a fist bump just to make sure he's relaxed. This was at his funeral, the funeral of Zamora. This is his wife speaking.
נועם ואיתי לא כאן, אבל הם ביקשו להשמיע גם הם את קולם כאן. נועם ואיתי לא כאן, אבל הם ביקשו להשמיע גם הם את קולם כאן.
אבא, אני אוהב אותך ומתגעגע. אבא, אני אוהב אותך.
She'll go on to say that she wants Arnon to be remembered, yes, as a hero, but also as that sweet, charming man, an amazing partner, perfect father. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is to remind us that these moments, such as the moment of the heroic rescue of Farhan Al-Qadi, these are individuals who, each of them is a world unto themselves, both the hostages and the heroes who are the soldiers or the families or the hostages themselves that are the heroes. These were 8 who were rescued and alive. Ori Magidash earlier in the war, Louis Har, Fernando Marman, Andrei Kozlov, Noah Argamani, Almon Meir Jan, Shlomi Ziv, and Al-Qadi Qaid Farhan. And these other moments of heroism, mundane as they seem, were also in the Olympics, where Israel wins 7 medals, which is record-breaking. But what you have here are moments that go beyond anything we can imagine, including with the Paralympics that to date, Israel has won 8 medals, including this gold medalist over here, Ami Dadon, with cerebral palsy, who started swimming when he was 6 years old and has won since the beginning of the games 3 medals, 2 of which were gold. This was just earlier today or yesterday when he won his 2nd gold. Now, the last
The hairs are sticking straight up.
What'd you say?
All the hairs on my arm and my legs
Yeah.
right now are completely sticking
So
straight up because of that.
what I
watching
have
you
for you
sing.
now to wind us down. Actually, I'm going to take my headphones out because I think they're dying. I don't know if you can still hear me. Tell me if it switches off to regular sound. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly fine.
Great. Okay. So Eden Golan, you may remember back to the Eurovision. And she ultimately took third place within all of the animosity and hatred that was out there. And there was a song called Hurricane, which was a rewrite of an original song that was written for the Eurovision called October Rain. And October Rain was canceled by the Eurovision because it was too political. After she came in third place, Eden Golan came to Hostage Square to sing for the first time the original lyrics of October Rain. It's mostly in English.
Writers of the history, stand with me, look into my eyes and see. People go away but never say goodbye. Someone stole the moon tonight, took my light. Everything is black and white. Who's the fool who told you boys don't cry? Hours and hours and flowers. Life is no game for the cowards. Why? The time goes by. Every day I'm losing my mind, holding on in this mysterious ride, dancing in the storm. We got nothing to hide. Take me home and leave the world behind. Baby, promise me that never again. I'm still wet from this October rain. October rain. Living in a fantasy, ecstasy, everything is meant to be. We shall pass, but love will never die. Hours and hours and flowers, life is no game for the cowards. Why? The time goes away. Every day I'm losing my mind, holding on in this mysterious ride, dancing in the storm. We got nothing to hide. Take me home and leave the world behind. Baby, promise me that never again. I'm still wet from this October rain. October rain. October rain. Baby, promise me that never again. I'm still wet from this October rain. October rain. Writers of the history, stand with כולם ילדים טובים אחד
Two more slides. One is this slide. Yanai Kaminka was a young officer. He was an officer, a platoon commander, barely 21 years old, in charge of a platoon of the search and rescue of the Home Front Command basic training, which is a mixed gender combat unit, who the ones who go in to pull people out of fallen buildings and such around the world. And just north of the Gaza Strip is where the base was. And he, along with a few of the other officers who were there and sergeants, replaced all of the new recruits who were guarding when the terrorists attacked, so that they would be the ones to encounter them. A few of the officers were killed, including Yanai. And the reason I brought you this was a piece that was written during his officer's course. He had to write his manifesto. And I won't read it for you. You can read it as I'm speaking. But when I think of the essence of who we are, maybe who we hope to be, with all of our faults, and there's plenty, and all the mistakes, and we've made many, and there's division which is fraying at that unity, and yet at our core, I believe that this young officer, Yanai Kaminka, shares with us the essence of why we do what we do. And if I want to get a sense, hold on, of how we see ourselves, there is an Israeli singing group, a hip-hop band called Hatikva Shesh. And this group, among other things, created a song in which they reflect who are all of these reserve duty soldiers. And then they zoomed in on one particular community and did a remake of their own song. They took Kibbutz Be'eri. But this is just a snapshot into how we Israelis see ourselves. We've seen throughout these last two sessions the overview of the war, the general sequence of events that unfolded, the South, the North, the center. We've looked at the internal unity and the fraying in the debate. We've looked at moments we've been proud of and those we have definitely not been. We've looked at highs and lows and the pain, and yet as a snapshot of who we are. This is the Hatikva Shesh singing about the members of Kibbutz Be'eri that could be any one of us.
אז הדפס שלנו מגולני, הכובסת היא משדרות, השכן שלנו בקומה מלמעלה כבר חודש מזיז כיסאות, מנהל הקהילה הגבוה, עושה משמרות בחמל, קשת ריכזה את כל התרומות ועכשיו היא חוקרת חלל, גילי מזכיר הקיבוץ הקשוח מבלה עם כולם במלון, לאט לאט השתלטנו פה ופתחנו גם את הקניון, והאבידה שלנו כפרה, שלרוב מגדל וחיטה, הוא לוחם אמיתי, מתאושש בגבורה, איך אתה מעורר השראה כאן. נכון כולם נראים רגילים, אבל זה קיבוץ של גיבורי על, בכל אחד מסתתר חבר יקר, שמתמודד עם האתגר. המטפלות שלנו כאן, שפותחות תמיד בזמן, מקבלות הילדים בחיבוק אמיתי בקומה 3 בגן, ויש את המדריכים בזוגון שהקפיאו תואר ראשון, ולמרות הכל הם עובדים קשה כל יום מסביב לשעון. יש פה דוגמנית פרמדיקית, יש פה חשמלאי שהוא טוטיסט, יש את חוגי נגן התופים המחונן שהוא קודם כל טנקיסט. יש לכולם כאב נסתר ואנחנו זועקים בכיכר, יש לנו דף מסרים והמון ביקורים ובדפוס אחד נהדר. ונכון כולם נראים רגילים, אבל זה קיבוץ של גיבורי העם, בכל אחד מסתתר חבר יקר שמתמודד עם האתגר. וזה לא משנה אם באמצע היום או באמצע ישיבת מזכירות, כולם יעזבו את הכל בשנייה אם יקראו לכיתת כוננות. פה זה לא יקום מקביל או איזה סרט בדיוני, זה הסיפור שלנו, קיבוץ בארי, זה הסיפור שלנו. ונכון כולם נראים רגילים, אבל זה קיבוץ של גיבורי העם, בכל אחד מסתתר חבר יקר שמתמודד עם האתגר.
משפחת בארי היקרה, עם חיבוק גדול ותקווה לימים טובים יותר, תשמרו על עצמכם, אוהבים אתכם, משפחת התקווה 6.
זה הסיפור שלנו, קיבוץ בארי.
Within all of the challenges that we're facing, and we're still in a place where you're probably not going to hear an Israeli very flippantly and easily, as in the past, say, "Yeh beseder," it'll be okay, because we just don't know. We're still not willing to give up. How do we get there? But we do know that there are those who are still willing to give their lives. And I don't mean just those soldiers. I mean to give their lives to make sure that we save those who can be saved. And we continue to remind ourselves who we know we can be. There's much we didn't talk about. Surprise, surprise, even as I steal 30 minutes from your lives extra. And yet, hopefully, we've been able to stitch enough together that you have a broader, if not deeper, sense of what we've gone through. Not just the war, but the entirety, the scope of what the state of Israel represents and means. Because we are currently in uncharted territory, and the more people have a real deep sense of what we're going through and where we're at, the more of a chance we have. Thank you.
Bravo. Bravo. Just, I feel, and I'm channeling a lot of the comments that have been placed into the chat here, by the way, which is just exceptional, the way that you shared. And I'm just so grateful to you, Ori. This has been a really valuable, important, and worthy way for us to remain connected and learn and increase our learning so that we can be even more connected. Because when you come from it from a place of, I don't want to say ignorance, but just kind of confusion or curiosity, then you really don't have the strength to really kind of understand and make sense of all that is going on. And you have truly, truly helped us be able to put things into the proper perspective and give us the context for what we're experiencing right now. So I'm so thankful, and I know I speak for everybody here.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm happy to take a few questions if people still have any koach, any strength, and the Zoom still runs. I'm happy to stick around.
Sure.
I saw there was one regarding the millions of dollars handed over to Hamas and why it took so long to respond to October 7th. So one, I don't have an answer about the millions of dollars. I can tell you what was said by those Netanyahu governments that was most of the time where that was happening, although it did continue also in the days of Bennett. And the idea was to create a humanitarian crisis on the one hand, and two, it seems as if, and this is based on certain cabinet members' responses, that this would allow Hamas to stay in place and thus destabilize the Palestinian Authority. And therefore, by putting more restrictions on the PA, would allow for a better chance to create a stronger Israeli presence in the West Bank, not enabling a Palestinian state to come to fruition. And a misperception that Hamas, as the government in Gaza, was looking for stability, and therefore would, at least for the moment, put down any immediate destructive tendencies towards the state of Israel. All of that is unofficial, as I don't have an official statement as to how and why that was allowed. As far as the response on October 7th, first of all, as I said in real time, when last time we spoke about that particular time, is that there's a lot of anger towards the fact that these kibbutzim were left to their own devices, and in fact, the entire Western Negev. And at the same time, there was such love and embrace because there is no dissonance between the IDF and everybody, meaning we're all one and the same. So it's not something which I think many countries have. I guess we don't have the luxury of other countries that allows us to disassociate ourselves with a military when we don't agree with the military, as we are all one and the same. It's not a symbiotic relationship because it's the one entity. And yet, if I want to analyze how and why it took so long, and sometimes it was more than 5 hours, one is because of what I said earlier, that we didn't anticipate, we had a certain conception of how strong we were, how weak our enemy was, and even the warning signs didn't penetrate what was perceived to be fact. And in fact, we fell into the exact same trap as 50 years minus a day, plus a day of what happened at the Yom Kippur War. The conception of how strong we were and how weak they were was so ingrained into who we were, we couldn't see what was right in front of us. Two, every place where there was a penetration, the firefights that were taking place there thought they were the only ones engaged in firefight. The fact there was between 3,000 and 5,000 terrorists that came across the border was not only unbelieved, it was unknown. And why was it unknown? A few reasons. One, because before the attack, there was all of our eyes were taken out as drones took out our command post that had the cameras on our borders. Those same cameras that were up until the last moment being utilized by those young women who were the tatzpitaniyot, the overseers. In addition, the communications were taken out, and there was a multi-pronged attack happening simultaneously by air, by sea, and by the 60 breach points along the fence. And there was heroic fighting that was unfolding, and yet every time a team got to a place, they thought that was it. And there was no overview of all the different places that could coordinate everyone else. And all of that is the facts as they unfolded. It can't possibly be a sufficient answer as to why the army wasn't there. We don't have all the answers yet. That's a starting point.
Thank you.
One last thing I want to share, and that is, first of all, if anyone has questions, they're always welcome to email Ori, and he'll be more than happy to address them. But I do want to say that Temple Beth Shalom is planning a trip to Israel this summer. What it's going to feel like or look like is still to be determined. However, one thing that I will definitely be working hard is to make sure that Ori joins us on that trip. So, so if you really want to learn and do so over a cup of coffee too, then that's the best way to do so. Is
Nothing like an 8-session plug.
That's right. So that's the other way, of course, is just want you to know that that's coming up down the line. My friends, it's 1:15 in the morning for Ori, although he's graciously 2:15 in the morning, excuse me. He graciously went over for us. He said that he has nothing going on tomorrow morning, so he's just going to sleep in. But I think we are all of one voice when we say Toda Rabah, from the deepest recesses of our hearts. Ori, it wasn't just teaching. You gave, first of all, the graphics and the PowerPoint was just exceptional. But putting that,
to fine tune my the subtitles. I'm not there yet, but
I think you're doing great with it. I was pretty impressed. But I was going to say, but even minus the extraordinary PowerPoint, you can just some people teach facts, you do, but you also teach your heart, and it's so abundantly clear. And listening to you, it just sets a little bit of a spark in our hearts too. It brings, I think we all, are brought just a little bit more connected and more closer to being there with you because of the way that you presented this material. And again, just gratitude just carries the day. So thank you so much, Ori, on behalf of everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Stay safe.
Laila Tov, my friend, and we'll be in touch.
Bye, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
All right, I'll stick around.